Hey, great day, everybody. Welcome to Word Wednesday. I'm Pastor Aaron Bell. So glad that you in the house or outside with me in the moment. Appreciate you guys for tuning in. Go ahead and hit that like button, hit that share button right where you are, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. Come on, go ahead and spread the gospel, spread it. Share this broadcast because you never know who needs to hear this on tonight. And trust me, we have a very important topic that I'd like for us to talk about and discuss on tonight. My good friend, a member of our church, Next Level Church, is AJ Bracy out of Collins Funeral Home there in Camden, South Carolina. He's on the broadcast tonight, and we're going to do a little rewind of something that we talked about some time ago. It's about making plans for the future. Listen, I just lost my father last month. Many of you know that. Thank you again for all your condolences, all your prayers and thoughts in that area. But if I had not had this talk with Brother Bracy, I don't think I would have been prepared for the moment. So it's one of those good talks that I'm asking you, I'm pleading for you, hit that share button, invite somebody to watch this broadcast, because you're going to get some great information on how to prepare for that day, because that day is coming. That day is coming. It's coming for you. It's also coming for your loved ones. So let's be prepared for the moment, okay? All right. Love y'all. Again, thank you so much for tuning in to this broadcast. If you missed an opportunity to give, here's an opportunity to do so. Information on the screen for you to give and sow into Next Level Church. Thank you guys for your faithful support of this ministry. I'm going to get out of the way so you can hear this important broadcast. Love y'all. Talk to you later. Bye-bye. Thank you for joining us for this special broadcast for Word Wednesday. This is let's just say this is a very interesting topic tonight. It's something that we all try to avoid, but we're all going to have to confront it one day in the future. So you might as well talk about it now. For those of you just joining me, I'm Pastor Aaron Bell. I'm here with my good friend, and we go way back. It's Anthony Bracy of Collins Funeral Services there in Camden, South Carolina. So we're on tonight, and we're talking about making plans for the future, So here's what I need you to do. If you haven't already done it, go ahead and hit this like button, hit this share button, share this broadcast. Go ahead and get your friends connected to this broadcast tonight, because this is an important interview. This is an important conversation topic that we're talking about tonight. So I need you to get on board and catch what we're talking about, because you're going to need this information sooner or later. and I'll say it from my standpoint.
That's right.
After having gone through several funerals over the past year, having to deal with families, some were prepared, some weren't prepared. And so, from me as a pastor, I understand it from a spiritual standpoint, and my job is to help people get ready for heaven. But there's also a practicality. There's also a reality here that we need to make sure that we're prepared, that our family members are prepared. So that's why I invited Brother Bracy on tonight, because I feel like this is a conversation, a presentation that needs to take place. And if I did it at the church, I'm not sure many people will come out for it. But so that's why I'm putting it online tonight, just making sure that people are able to see it and able to hear it and receive this information, and also make good decisions moving forward, not just for them, but for those that are connected with them. So help me welcome Anthony Bracy to the broadcast. Thank you so much, Anthony, for being with us. AJ, I call you AJ. Thank you so much for being with me on tonight. Welcome to Word Wednesday at Next Level Church. So let's go ahead and get into this. If you don't mind, Brother Bracy, just tell us a little bit about what you do and why this topic is important for us.
So as you mentioned, I'm owner and managing director of Collins Funeral Home located in Camden, South Carolina. A little bit about my background. I've been in the funeral business come the end of December will be 20 years. So for 20 years, I've worked in some form of funeral service. Mm-hmm. I've also worked in some other areas in life, but this is really, I think, more of my mission, my calling. So some of the things to kind of share with you that I'm responsible for. As I said, I'm the owner and managing director, so I kind of do a little bit of everything. But my job is to meet with families, prepare funeral services, get all the information that's needed whenever somebody passes away. And like I say, from there, prepare every aspect of a funeral. So it's a lot that's involved with that. And what I try to encourage many people to do is plan ahead, mm-hmm. to be prepared before that time comes. because a lot of folks, they try to put this topic on the back burner. I mean, nobody wants to talk about the end. It's funny because we'll talk about heaven all day long. Everybody wants to go to heaven. Nobody really wants to go to, they want heaven. They just don't want to actually get there.
Mm-hmm.
And part of getting there is we do have to transition out of this life. And transition out of this life, there are a lot of different things that actually happen, which if you're allowed to take a little time to kind of explain what happens when somebody passes away, and then kind of segue into why we need to pre-plan and why we need to make preparations for not only our funeral, but also for our final affairs. And when I say final affairs, everybody thinks about just a funeral, but final affairs, all making plans, what happens with your vehicles, what happens to everything that you've collected in your life. And a lot of times we don't think about it. Individuals, we have a lot of things that we accumulate that are very important to us, but it might not be that important to those that are left behind. So you kind of have to make plans for all of that. But first, if you're allowing me, Pastor, I want to just talk a little bit about what happens when somebody passes away.
Sure.
When somebody passes away or transitions, the first thing that typically happens is if their family's not there, family's notified and they're allowed to come. And at that time, whoever, if you're at the hospital, you're at a nursing home, or even if a person dies at home, somebody's going to come to you and they're going to ask you, what funeral home would you like to select? And at that time, that's a heavy question, because unless you've actually made funeral arrangements before, or unless your family has had deaths in the family, you may not know who to call. So then you end up just picking somebody that you've seen their name, or picking somebody out of a list that they provide to you. And I want to share, you don't actually have to do that at the time somebody passes away. If you're unprepared, you can't, you know what, we're not prepared to make this decision right now. Especially if it's a situation where a person's at the hospital, they have a place where your loved one can be placed until a funeral home selection is made. And so at that time, I would encourage you to call funeral homes to get a feel for if it's somebody whose personality aligns with you, if they can provide the services you need, and also looking at pricing. At the end of the day, all funeral homes have the same purpose, which is to help the living dispose of the dead. But each one of us go about it differently in how we do it. And so that's the part that's important to know. Once you make a decision on a funeral home, the first thing that happens is the hospital, nursing home, medical examiner, or coroner, they will contact the funeral home that you selected, and they provide them with what information they have, and they tell us where your loved one is located. We then send somebody to pick your loved one up from the place of passing, bring them back to the funeral home, and then we contact you to say, hey, we need to know what decisions you want to make. And there's a lot of decisions that we have to make in a short amount of time. First thing that most people usually ask is, what is your plan for type of services? And when I talk about services, we're really talking about the disposition, which is what most funeral directors want to know. They want to know if you're planning on doing a cremation or if you're planning on doing a burial. So if you say, hey, I'm doing a burial, the next question they're automatically going to say, are you doing a burial with public viewing? Because now we need to know if you want your loved one embalmed. They have to make preparation with the body. They're going to schedule a time for you to come in. If you're doing a cremation, we still have to ask that same question, because cremation doesn't mean that you can't have a full funeral with the viewing. It just means that instead of going and taking the body to a cemetery at the end of the funeral or end of ceremony, we're going to actually cremate the body. So those are things the funeral director has to be kind of aware of, because they have to know that information from a planning purpose. But as a family, this is one thing that families have to be prepared for, because with cremation, we have to involve people in a lot of cases. Yeah. So I know, Pastor, I know this is kind of in some ways a little sensitive, because y'all have just gone through this recently. When it's a husband and a wife, the spouse makes a decision for the disposition of their loved one, and they control that whole process. So in the case of us, Cassandra say, we're going to bury AJ or we're going to cremate him. She's already told me we're not cremating you. So she's made that decision. But in the event that she had passed on and it's just me, then it passes to our children. And so in some cases, for us, that's easy because it's still just one child. But in some families where there's 3 or 4 children, that's where it becomes complicated because in South Carolina, they have a law that says the right of the majority prevails. So if you got 3 out of 4 siblings that want cremation, 3 out of 4 can sign. The fourth could possibly try to pose legal issues. The siblings have to come together and make that decision together. So it kind of complicates matters. So that's one thing that you have to be prepared for, kind of understand, kind of know what type of service you're looking for. The thing that typically happens, like I said, after this phone conversation, the funeral home goes behind the scenes. They make preparations that's needed for the body, but then they also plan for you to come in to make arrangements. And when you come in to make arrangements, a lot of people feel like this is like you're going to come in, you're going to pick out a nice casket or an urn or whatever. It's going to be a 10 to 20 minute process. You get a bill for what all you need. And it's a lot more involved than that. You're planning to write an obituary, which is somebody's life story that you're trying to compress to a 1, maybe 2-page document to pick out the most important highlights. You are also at that same time working on information that the funeral director needs for a death certificate. In the case of a cremation, you're filling out paperwork for cremation. Depending on how the family plans on taking care of the financial portion of the funeral director may be working with them going through insurance to figure out what value the insurance holds, who's the beneficiary. So there's a lot of moving pieces in planning for a funeral. I tell a lot of people it's like planning for a wedding, but instead of having 6 months to a year to go and pick out dresses and pick out everything, I do all of that in literally like a day or two. Everything from flowers to style of program, everything. So like I said, there's a lot of detail that goes into a funeral that a lot of us don't think about, but it's something that's important for us to have pre-planned. Pastor, it looks like I almost feel like you had something you wanted to ask me there.
Well, I do, because you just hit on some things that, gosh, I can think of a couple of funeral services that I was a part of that the family didn't have any insurance, and they were actually raising money for, asking people to give an offering to help bury the deceased person. And it's almost embarrassing. And one reason why I brought you on is because I'm like, man, help us help those who probably don't even have insurance. What can they do ahead of time? Because again, a lot of people don't like to be a part of these conversations. They like to avoid these conversations. They think that their loved ones are going to live forever, and so they don't necessarily plan for moments like this. But I don't know. I just look at those services that I was part of, and then just feel embarrassed. Like, come on, guys, y'all, we got to do something. I mean, this is embarrassing. What would you say to that? And by the way, how much is a typical service cost?
So you're absolutely correct. That has, and I've had to sit at the table with families where that's happened, and it's a hard conversation. I've had situations where we thought there was insurance, and then when we called to verify the insurance policy, come to find out the died was paying the insurance, and they had allowed pride to get in the way. Didn't want everybody to know that they didn't have the financial means to keep the policy up, and the policy lapsed. So now you got a family that's planned this whole entire funeral service, and there's no money for a funeral. So as you said, now they're looking at doing fundraisers, GoFundMes. And really, I try to get people to stay away from the GoFundMes because they're going to take a percentage of the money you collect as an administration fee. One thing I did, and I don't, if a family asks me about it, we have a crowdfunding with one of the software vendors that I use for making arrangements, where the family gets 100% credit for every donation that's made. So unlike GoFundMe, where, and I had a family recently do this, where they did a GoFundMe, they got $2,000 collected, but instead $1,800 was actually what was processed, because after fees and everything, it was a little over $1,800 that went towards the funeral bill. But really, we don't want to get in those situations if we don't have to. So what I tell folks, funerals, it all depends on what you want to select. If we're talking about simple disposition or disposal of the body, which would be a cremation or a burial with no service, or a service where the funeral home is not involved, which in that case would be like a memorial service. Those are your lowest cost options. What we could do, some cremation providers that do cremation that start as low as $8.95. Now, the key to always tell everybody, you know, that old saying, that old adage, you get what you pay for. Sometimes you find out $8.95 is not really $8.95 when you get there, because there's now this added fee for this, added fee for that, and you end up right at about $1,200-1,300. But realistically, if we're talking about a cremation with no service, I shared that, you know, in my funeral home, that's under $1,300, so it's about $1,245, and like I said, that's without a service. With a memorial service, we're looking on average about $1,000. When we get into funerals, traditional burial, I know at my funeral home, we start right at around $5,300. And it goes up from there. But that's $5,300 is the bare basics. It's not an elaborate service. Mm-hmm. And so how do we, if there's some situations where people either A, can't afford life insurance, or B, there may be, because of health conditions, they can't get life insurance.
Okay.
You have an option to go to a funeral home, and I'll use my funeral home as an example. We are a licensed pre-need funeral provider. That means is that we have a license from the state where you can sit down with us, you can discuss your funeral, and you can pre-plan your funeral, and then actually go ahead and prepay for it. So as we prepare, we'll talk about everything just like we would do with a normal at-need arrangement conference. Mm-hmm. And then after we do that we do that arrangement conference, just like we would do it at need. But it's kind of weird because I'm sitting there asking you questions about you. So normally I'm asking your family, what do you want to do for mom? What do you want to do for dad? Now I'm sitting there like, what do you want me to do when, you know, you pass on? Right. So right. It's a heavy question, but it's good because at that time, a lot of people get to say, well, you know, this is what I really want. Yeah. And sometimes when kids hear that, if a parent says, I don't want an elaborate funeral, I want something simple but nice, we sit down and figure out how much it costs. You can actually make payments on that funeral and pay for it in advance. Okay. So there's 3 options that we use with prepaid funerals. We can use pre-funded insurance, pre-funded annuities, and pre-funded trust. Mm-hmm. And now, for the most part, I use insurance and annuities. So I have a licensed insurance agent that's on staff. We write pre-need burial policies. So I'll go through, we talk about what you want. That person sitting in the room, they're asking the same questions. We discuss the funeral plans. Let's say the funeral comes up to $7,000. Mm-hmm. We give a family then the option of doing a single pay, meaning if they have $7,000, they can go ahead and pay for it up front. Okay. Or if they don't have $7,000, they could say, well, you know, I need to spread this out. They have the option to break the payments for the funeral down over 3 years, 5 years, or a maximum of 10 years. So by doing it that way, you can find something that's within your budget, that's affordable. The benefit, though, is with our pre-need funerals that are done by insurance, if you're paying for it, it's just like a life insurance policy that you would obtain. 2 years, 1 day is fully covered. So let's say somebody does a 3-year payment plan on a funeral. They hadn't finished paying it off, but it's been a little over 2 years. Something happens, you pass away unexpectedly. They're now going to, that pre-need funded insurance policy is going to pay off the full funeral, full face value. So your family doesn't have to, yes. And if it's been a year, then they will pay a percentage they'll pay back the premiums plus a percentage of interest. Mm-hmm. There's some products, there's one product that we use where everything within the first year, you get like 70% of the face value of the policy, which is a lot better than you just saying, I'm going to go and take the money, put it in a bank account and just try to wait until I get all the money together. Mm-hmm. The other option is annuities. Now, annuities is kind of like a savings account per se. I use those in situations without, I guess, disclosing. I've had a couple of folks here lately that have been up in their golden years where they can't get insurance, or they decided to cancel out insurance because they essentially lived too long. Had a gentleman, he's over 100 years old. He realized, he said, I can't live another 100 years, but he's not going to actually, he's going to actually end up, at this point, he's paying more for life insurance than what he would get out of it.
Wow.
So he made a decision before even coming to the funeral home, I need to go ahead and use my money differently. So instead, he came in, picked out his funeral, and decided to go ahead and prepay for it. And so at his case, nobody's going to issue a policy on somebody that's that old. They're like, look, I don't care if he has all the money. It's too much of a risk. So we use an annuity because an annuity is a security product, but the money does grow.
Okay.
Money in an investment vehicle where it pays the funeral home and it helps the funeral home offset costs for inflation.
Right.
And then the last option is trust. Now, I don't offer trust at my funeral home because they're a little bit more complicated, but also the growth is not there. And what tended to happen in the funeral business, a lot of people in the old days would write trust accounts and families never finished paying for them. So it did them more harm than it did good, because when somebody would pass away, man said, well, Mama's been paying on her funeral. And we said, well, yeah, Mama was paying on her funeral, but she stopped paying. This is what she paid in. This is the interest that's on it. But now, if you have the way the contract was written, you pretty much still owe for a full face value for a funeral. So we're able to put those monies aside. And like I say, if you don't have life insurance, I would encourage people to go that option, because at least then you know what your funeral is going to cost. You're paying towards your funeral. And the best thing about it, whether you choose a single pay, 3 pay, 5 pay, or 10 pay, when you make that last payment, it's taken care of. Okay. So whether you live 20 years, 30 years from the time you make the arrangement, you don't have to worry about my funeral arrangements. And prepaid funeral arrangements are transferable. So let's say, for whatever reason, the funeral home goes out of business, it's transferable to another funeral home. So, my answer, I get that question, Pastor. I would encourage people that don't have insurance or hadn't started planning, and that insurance may not necessarily be affordable, or that they may have health conditions that may preclude them from getting insurance. Talk with a funeral home that does pre-need planning, where they can show you all of your options. In some cases, the insurance may be the cheaper route to go for them to get a life insurance policy. The only downside to that is I can guarantee the price of a funeral also.
Okay. Gotcha.
I know I mentioned also, I mentioned earlier too about some things about planning for the future. So not only with planning for burial, one thing that a lot of people sometimes don't think about is after a person has a funeral, they're buried, life still continues for everybody else.
Yeah.
So there's also, you need to have financial and estate planning for your family. In my case, I'm the breadwinner, so I plan ahead, and I have policies that are in place to take care of my wife and my son for a minimum of 5 years, to make sure that if something happens to me, that life doesn't dramatically change overnight for them. I need to give them some time to be able to change their living situation or adjust. I made sure that there's enough life insurance to where it would pay off my business, pay off our home, pay off our cars, pay off any debts that we need to pay off. But at the same time, they would still have enough income to live off of for 5 years, at least 5 years. Right now it's projected more, but with the way that the economy is going, inflation and all of that, who knows? But part of our financial planning, we need to have estate planning done, where I would encourage everybody to have a will, especially if you have real property. It makes matters of transferring property a little simpler, because otherwise you go through probate court. And here's where that can get tricky. You get probate court, and let's say in this case of your parents, well, let's say Mama passes away, Daddy's still living. Daddy says, well, that's fine, I own everything because I was married to her. That's not always true. It depends on the probate laws of the state in which you live in. Some states, the children and the spouse share the property equally. So anything that would have come to that estate would split between the spouse and the children.
Okay.
So that comes to surprise for some people, because the kids might not get along with Mama, or there may be a situation where it's a blended family.
Right.
And that's where problems usually. So a will prevents those type of problems from happening. you make a clear delineation as to who you want to have what properties and how you want things to be handled. The other thing, and there's a service, and I wish I had found the name of that service before we got on this call tonight, Pastor, but there's a service that I utilized once before at another funeral home that I worked at, and they came and did a presentation for us. But they help families declutter homes because, as I mentioned, you have a whole life that's built in your house.
Yeah.
I know right now I'm actually sitting in our family room, and I'm looking across on the other side, and I have my study, and so I have now you have 2 bookcases full of that I can look at and see from my seat right now of all of my seminary resources. So I have my ministry books there. Then I have another shelf that's ministry youth records from when I youth pastored. I have a couple of more bookshelves around the house that's full of business stuff. I have all of this stuff, and I always think about it. I look at it and I say, all this stuff is important to me, but the moment I close my eyes, my wife's going to have a big old Herbie Kirby outside and stuff is going into it. But if you have a plan, you can kind of plan like, okay, don't just throw all my books away. Pastor Bell might need some of this stuff at the church. I want this person to have this. I want this to have that. And there's organizations that help you declutter like that, where things that are of value can be donated to organizations where it can be used. And even if you don't use a company to help you do that, having something written out, maybe saying like, I want all of my clothing to go to Oliver Gospel Mission or this particular ministry, because these are things that, like I said, we don't think about, but decisions that have to be made after somebody passed away.
Right.
If you're going to sell the house, you got to
the house. What people don't realize is that after you receive information about the death, and you got to start going into funeral planning mode. You're planning the service. You're trying to get the obituary together. You're trying to get all the speakers at the service and all that But when the service is gone and the repast is passed, and the people, and then it's just you, and then you're having to experience the aftermath of the funeral, and then you're looking at all this stuff that, now how am I going to clean out this house? How am I going to clean up? Yes, that's very important. And so it's not only making plans for the funeral, but making plans after the funeral.
That's right. And I'll say this too. One thing that we don't always think about, all of us have have something in life that we may not want everybody to know. Make sure you have a friend that's going to take care of those secrets for you.
That's good. That's good. Yeah. That's good.
But really, like I said, these are things that we don't think about. It's more than just a funeral, because the funeral is just like a wedding. It's one day. It's a ceremony that kind of gives us closure to acknowledge that person lived, acknowledge that person died. Yeah. But there's, in my business, to be honest, I spend more time dealing with families in the aftermath, because a lot of times we'll go through the funeral and everybody will compliment me. Oh, Mama looks so good, and that program was beautiful, and the service was great. And then the next week, they're sitting there like, okay, now we got to figure out what we're going to do with Mama's car. Now we got to figure out what we're going to do with Mama's house. What about a lawyer for probate? What about this? Headstones, if they're buried, we need to, do a marker, a headstone. And that's something that a lot of people hadn't even, thought about, because you do it maybe, like I said, once or twice in your lifetime. But now what I'm experiencing is kind of sticker shock with a lot of people, because the costs have gone up so much since people have probably planned a funeral or done any monuments. So right now, for a single headstone for one person, for an upright, we're looking at a little over $1,000. And I have people like, wow, I thought that would only be about $300 to $400. And I have to explain, the costs have gone up. The cost of granite, the cost of stencil, the cost of labor. And then after you do all that, the government likes to get their money out of everything too. So then you got tax on all of those things. Yeah. And so
is it cheaper? Is it cheaper to do cremation or just to do a typical burial?
Well, that's a loaded question. Cremation can be cheaper, but what I always preface that is cremation without a service is going to be cheaper than a traditional burial. without a service.
Okay.
Here's the reason being. Like I said, direct cremation. My lowest cost direct cremation, we do a simple, what we call the simple direct cremation. It's $12.45. That's the cost for us going to pick up someone's loved one from the place of death. I have commercial refrigeration at the funeral home, so I do commercial refrigeration for the family. That's for us doing just immediate family, doing identification of their loved one and transporting them to the crematory and bringing them back in a simple black plastic box. We provide a minimal container for the cremation for the body to go inside of. So all of that is $12.45. They still have to pay for coroner's permit, death certificates. South Carolina charges $12 for the first, $3 for each additional at the same time. So, by law, we have to take one of those death certificates to the crematory when we do the cremation.
Okay.
So when you factor all of that in, typically most cremations that I actually do, once you add in the cost of death certificates and everything, it's usually right around $12.80, $12.95, somewhere in there once you add the death certificates, the coroner's permit. Because each county has a different fee for their permit. So it all depends on where somebody dies. Richland County is $20 right now. Kershaw County is $20, but there's some counties that don't charge. There are some counties like Lexington and Fairfield where it's $50.
Okay.
We have to kind of know those fees, but I sell that to say on the lower end, we're right around $1,300 for a simple cremation. But then again, if we're doing a cremation with a memorial service, it's about $2,000. Okay. But the caveat there is if you do a burial, and you can do a burial without a funeral, we call that a immediate burial. My immediate burials start around $2,400.
Okay.
Reason being is a little bit more labor involved. And then here's the other catch: you got to get cemetery space. So that's what I've seen here recently, because I've had several families, they want a traditional funeral, but because of either not having an attachment to the area where they live any longer, or everybody being mobile, they've done a funeral and done a cremation, or just the cost of cemetery space. Most of your perpetual care cemeteries, just for the space alone, you're spending a little over $1,000 for the space. Some places could be $2,000 to $3,000 just for the land, just for the space to bury your loved one. Then you have the cost of opening and closing.
Yeah.
Yes. So if it's perpetual care, for instance, Pastor, when we first really started hanging out, I was working at a perpetual care cemetery funeral home combination, and I think back, opening and closing was $15.95 Monday through Friday between the hours of 8 and I think it was 3:30 or something like that. If it came after 3:30, then there was an additional $200 fee for overtime hours. There was an additional fee for Saturday, additional fee for Sunday. So perpetual care, the cost of the cemetery could almost be as much as the cost for the funeral. Once you got through the space, the opening and closing, they're required out of burial container, not to mention a marker or headstone. So when you factor all of that, cremation can be the cheaper route. But you can also still have a traditional funeral and do a cremation and not have to worry about the burial piece, where that's a lot of times where people get stuck on cost. And even with church cemeteries now, like for instance, we don't have our own cemetery at Next Level, but a lot of the churches that do, I've had some difficult conversations where when I've called the church and let them know that Brother Joe has passed away or Mother Susie's passed away, the church is, I'm so sorry to hear that, but Mother Susie wasn't financial. And the next question is, well, what do you mean? Well, they're a member, but they haven't been in tithes and offerings, or some churches may have a requirement of how much members had to pay in. So there again, they're not financial. How much is the space for them? And I've had a couple of churches that I know just off the top of my head recently where the families had to pay $1,800 for a space, or one case they had to pay $3,000 for a space. In the $3,000 case, that turned into, let's do a funeral with cremation. And because when they looked at the costs, it was something that they didn't plan for. So that's the other piece of this too, is making plans for the future. Like I said, Next Level people, we don't have a cemetery, so we got to look for a cemetery where we want to be buried if burial is your choice.
Right.
But if you're a member of of a church where they have a cemetery, make sure you know what's in that church's bylaws and constitutions about your burial rights.
Okay.
That's the thing I remember growing up. Pastor, I'm sure you remember that growing up. Everybody said, keep your church membership because
keep your church membership. Yeah,
that's your burial right.
Well, AJ, let me ask you this: How would you have that conversation with a parent about planning for the future? Because some people are hesitant, apprehensive about talking to their elderly parents about stuff. How would you approach that? What would you advise? Besides saying, like the prodigal son, give me my portion, give me my inheritance.
It's a difficult conversation, but at some point you have to sit down and say, hey, we need to have a talk.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, there's a video I used to share on my website. I'm thinking about adding it back on, but there is an actual video that talks about it. It's called The Talk, that talks about having this conversation with parents and or elderly family members and friends. But you really need to sit down and say, hey, I know it's a difficult conversation, but I need to know do you have any wishes for your burial? What have you given thought for that? Because I'm not saying something's going to happen tomorrow, but I just want to know so that I can honor your wishes and do what you would want for me to do for you when that time comes. I'm in some ways, I would say I was lucky growing up. My grandparents, they talked about this all the time. So when I was a kid, my grandmother had this suitcase. She used to always tell me all my important papers are in that suitcase.
Yeah.
And for the most part, it was a lot of junk in the suitcase too, but there was a lot of important documents, life insurance on family members, her life insurance, my grandfather's. But they would sit down and they would actually have that talk with me. So, for me growing up, I'm used to the talk, but a lot of people may not be. But you need to have that conversation where, do you want to be cremated? Do you want to be buried? If you want to be buried, do you have a particular place you want to be buried? Or do you have options? My mother and I just actually had this conversation, not for herself, but we were talking about my uncle, who was actually the first funeral that I had as the owner of Collins Funeral Home. Mm-hmm. So, kind of to go back and get some background, I was working at Collins and I bought a funeral home that I worked at, but I was working for corporate owned funeral home at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so corporate owned funeral home had no idea what I was doing. I was, I'd been working on this whole deal for about 7 or 8 months. And we were in closing. Uh-huh. We were in closing and my uncle dies.
Okay.
And so my mother calls me and I'm at work and she, explained. So we sat down and we talked about it. She was telling me she had that talk with my uncle. And she's like, I remember having the talk with your uncle. And she was like, I asked him, because we were talking about, our family actually has a cemetery. So my mother's mother family, it's called DeBose Cemetery, but anybody who is a blood relative or married into the DeBose family, by birthright is given a spot in the family cemetery. Growing up, I always heard about it. And then when I actually got into business and started going there, I'm like, I don't want my spot in the family cemetery. It's back in the country, it's in the woods.
Ain't nobody gonna go.
Nobody's ever going back there now. Yes.
Right.
But my mother went through it. My uncle had always said, I want to be buried at DeBose Cemetery. I want to be buried at DeBose. So she went through and she said, look, you can be buried by our parents at the church. You can go to DeBose Cemetery, or you want to be buried in Bethune next to your. And he chose to go there beside his wife, because his whole life he always said, I'm going to be buried at DeBose Cemetery. But, she had to have those difficult conversations because my uncle had cancer. Okay. And while he had moments of improvement, she realized, hey, time's going to come. And so as she was talking about that the other day, and we had already talked about having this conversation ourselves, it's just a reminder. It's important to have those conversations. And so she had that talk with him probably at least a good 2 to 3 months before he died. But she had been having that conversation with him for years. So when she sat down with him and said, hey, we need to have a talk. It was a topic that while she didn't want to talk about it, she was comfortable enough because they had that relationship over the years where she knew what he said, but she wanted to be sure when that time comes. Yeah. And the first thing she said was, if we bury you at the family cemetery, your son's now going to have to go 2 places to visit. And he thought about that. He said, just bury me there beside her. And so that's what we did.
Okay. Yeah.
But we honored his wishes because she had that talk with him, like I said, about 2 or 3 months. So if anyone has, kind of a fear, one of the ways that you can always have that talk is you can always start out by sharing memories. And I'm going to tell you why this is important. You start off by saying, I want to hear some memories. Tell me some things about when you were growing up. Tell me a little bit about your youth, childhood. Tell me about your first job and what you did when you were living or when you were younger and working, especially for like an older parent or grandparent. And when you're doing this, tell them, I want to take notes because I don't want to forget anything. And you're writing all of this down. And it's important because this is going to help you with writing obituaries.
Yeah.
It's going to help you with information because the biggest thing that I see people always forget, I'm required to ask certain questions. So I always ask, tell me, and we're just going to say for the purpose of an example, Mama Smith. Tell me what Mama Smith, where she was born at. And the first thing everybody in the room looks and says, oh, you know what? She was buried in South Carolina, or she was born in South Carolina. And I'm like, okay, where in South Carolina?
Where in South Carolina?
Hold on, let me call Aunt. Yeah. So then they call Aunt Susie.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, right. Well, we lived in a little community called, Tukidoo.
Yeah.
So then I have to say, okay, so you're Blythewood. Because, there are certain areas people lived in, it's a community, but that's not the actual place of birth. So you have to try to capture that information because a lot of times I'm in arrangement conferences and members, and then sometimes I've seen older family members actually getting arguments about that because you got one brother is like, well, no, our brother was born at the hospital in Columbia. And then somebody else says, no, you don't remember. That's the other sibling. And then, oh, yeah, you're right. And then the question starts becoming, well, does anybody really remember what happened?
Correct.
You can ask these questions when, obtaining records. It helps. And that's also a segue into once you start asking all of those questions about family history, knowing family, and even maybe pulling out a photo album as you're going through that process and be like, well, tell me about this person. Tell me about that person, because it helps you to build a story and it helps make that conversation a little.
I would say that there are a couple things here that you hit on that is really important for those watching. First of all, have that creative talk like AJ, Mr. Bracey just talked about. Just bring it up, share some memories about your past, that kind of thing. Because what you're doing is actually in your mind going ahead and recording an obituary. So, because I've seen too many families kind of struggle with that. Well, where was so-and-so born? Well, what was his life about? What was her life about? And so if you can go ahead and formulate those things ahead of time, that'd be good for you. But secondly, he hit on this too, is go ahead and whether it's for you or for somebody else, have that hiding place where you store those important papers. I mean, even my wife and I, we've talked about this. This is where go to this closet, go to this space to get this important information about me. If something were to happen to me or something were to happen to you.
Tell somebody where is that. Tell somebody where that hiding place is.
Yes. Yeah, that is so key. That is so key. Hey, go ahead and try to get organized so that it's not hard for somebody to come behind you and find out where to go and get this important stuff. But I also want to share this too, and I think, and I'd like you to comment on this too, is because I was going to ask you, when is the best time to have this talk? When is the best time to actually think about planning for your future? And I normally say this: after you have attended a funeral, that's probably is best for you because it's right there at your face. Because if you go about your day, go about your week, get back into your job, your workplace and all that, you're not going to think about it. But if you have to, the best time that's what happens with married people. The best time they think about marriage is when they're around other weddings and stuff like that. So I say when you're in the moment, go ahead and take advantage of the moment and say, you know what? I just went through this with this family. What do I want for my life? What do I want for my family after me?
A great point. But, I'm going to take it a step further, Pastor. Mm-hmm. It's Word Wednesday. Mm-hmm. So tomorrow you need to be having Talk Thursday. So
good one. I like that.
Because nobody knows the moment or the hour.
That's right.
Bible tells us that. Scripture tells us. David said he was just one step one breath away from death.
Right.
So
Gotcha.
we have to realistically look at, nobody knows the moment when their life is going to come to an end. And I've had the honor and the privilege of being able to serve friends and serve families, but I've served a lot of people that got up that had plans for that day, that didn't live to see those plans through. So it's important to go ahead and make it, because you make the plan, let somebody know about the plan, and then you can forget about the plan. Now, it's important also, and I'll highlight this, whatever plan you do, you need to review it every so often.
Okay.
You don't have to review it every day. You don't have to review it once a month. But you need to review your plans, your final arrangements. At least if you don't do it once a year, at least plan to do it like once every 3 years. Even if you've already paid for everything, do an insurance review. Because what happens sometimes too is, and I caught this with for myself with an insurance review, I noticed something seemed right, and I contacted one of my agents, and I was just doing an insurance review, and I was looking at adding some coverage. Come to find out, I had a policy that the home company had canceled, not my agent. And they were saying, well, we didn't get payment for that policy. I said, well, you have payment. They went back and looked and they said, you're absolutely right. We made an error. There was a technical glitch. We didn't draft your payment. Because we didn't draft your payment, we canceled your policy. And you never got notified. So if I hadn't have done that review, I wouldn't have known policy, but I did the review because I had an option to add additional insurance. So I still went ahead and added additional insurance, but I had that policy reinstated and everything, went on. But this is the other time when that review is also important. Life changes happen, and I've seen this happen. Somebody dies that's your beneficiary. You get to change the beneficiary. You may have to go through probate court or get a lawyer to get insurance funds that may be needed to pay for a funeral. Or you forget to change your beneficiary and you win a divorce. Now your ex-spouse may be able to claim funds that you needed to take care of kids or take care of final expenses. And that ex-spouse might be the one that says, I went through a lot with you and I'm keeping this, and you ain't getting none of it. And
I got you.
Yes.
I got you.
And there's nothing I can do about it.
Well,
so
great, man.
Like I said, review the plan periodically, but make the plan. And like I said, it's Word Wednesday. You go out and have Talk Thursday.
Gotcha. Well, you hit on it because
finalize it on Friday.
Finalize it on Friday. I like that. Well, we're out of time right now, but I was going to ask you to give us any last piece of advice, but I think you just hit on it. I like this. It's Word Wednesday. Have a Talk Thursday and finalize it on Friday. So good information tonight. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for taking time to talk with us. And I pray that those of you that are watching got something out of this, because this is some good information. Again, Word Wednesday, Talk Thursday, finalize it on Friday. Have these important conversations. They are important. Not only have these conversations, but jot it down somewhere. Let some people know where the important stuff is for your life, so that if anything happens to you, then they'll know how to follow up behind you. And not only that, have it, plan your estate, have your estate all together, so that once the service is over, once the funeral is over, that your family won't be left hanging, that they'll be able to move on with comfort and peace moving forward for the future. So thank you again, Anthony. I really do appreciate it. Thanks for talking with us tonight. All right.